I just want to say it's nice to be back at Mount Royal. I actually attended Mount Royal for one semester after I made the bad decision of going to business school at the University of Calgary right out of high school. And in the middle of my fourth semester, I was so depressed and disgusted with myself for having chosen that path that I basically just dropped out. And the university sent me a nice letter saying, don't come back until you've demonstrated that you are committed to your education. So I came over to Mount Royal College when I finally decided what I wanted to do, and was, I guess, pleasantly surprised at the quality of the teaching. Some of the best teachers I've had in my post-secondary education now over 15 years were at Mount Royal University. And it's just wonderful to come back here and see how it's growing as an institution. It's now a 4-year degree-granting university, and the infrastructure is amazing. So thank you very much to Mount Royal University, and in particular, it was him that liked the idea and helped champion it over the last, I don't know, 6 months. And I'm glad to see I'm not the only male with long hair. A few other thank yous, I think, are required. Dan Thorburn isn't here from the Calgary Foundation, but the Calgary Foundation, once we conceptualized this panel, was quick to provide some financial assistance so that we could bring all these esteemed thinkers and scientists from around Canada to participate here today. So I just want to thank the Calgary Foundation for their important support. And of course, the panelists themselves, who all lead busy lives and would probably rather be out hiking in, say, the Muskoka or something like that, but have taken time out of their professional and personal lives to come here. And is that still okay? Yeah. Okay. So just briefly, how did we get here? Well, Parks Canada agency celebrated its 100th anniversary last year, and rightfully was proud of many of its accomplishments over the last century. And I think as Canadians, we would all agree that our national park system is one of the best in the world, and we're very blessed to have it. But as a muckraking journalist, I took it upon myself to do a little research and just find out exactly where we are with respect to ecological integrity in our national parks, and whether we as a society were doing as good a job as we could, or even that we thought we were doing. And parsing peer-reviewed research, I found that while much has improved over the last 15 years since the Banff Valley study and since the federal panel on the ecological integrity of Canada's national park was struck in 2000, much had improved, but there was still a great deal of room for improvement. And so I submitted my article, which was in Alternatives Journal, one of my favorite publications, to this conference, just to get it out there and maybe be able to interact with some people who were thinking about some of the same opportunities and problems. And then it dawned on me that maybe it would be better to get the experts on these things to come and speak to the issue rather than my sole perspective based on a limited amount of research that I had done. So Robert Boschman thought a panel was a great idea, and we put it together, and here we are today. So thank you very much, guys, for coming. So I'm gonna introduce them briefly. I'm not gonna introduce what they're gonna talk about. They can do that themselves in order of appearance. So first up will be Pamela Wright, who's an associate professor in outdoor recreation and tourism management at the University of Northern British Columbia. And she was the vice chair of that original panel on the ecological integrity of Canada's national parks. So it's really great to have her here today. Alison Woodley will speak next. She's the National Conservation Director at the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, which is one of the longest standing and strongest voices for our parks and protected areas in Canada. Thank you very much for being here. It's great to have you. Third, Tom Nuds, who I've never met before. He's a professor in the Department of Integrated Biology at the University of Guelph, and was also a member of the original panel on ecological integrity in Canada's national parks. And I just realized that number 1 wasn't the one that was starting, number 0 was the one that was starting. Because I've written one and we need to put Sean Fluker is actually going to go first. He's a local. He's a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. And he and I have known each other for a few years with respect to issues relating to national parks. So, following Tom will be Rosalind Warner. We needed a political scientist, I thought, to sort of round out the panel and make it this sort of interdisciplinary affair that this conference seems to represent. And she's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Okanagan College. And then we'll have John Schultes, who's also from the University of Northern British Columbia, associate professor in outdoor tourism and recreation. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome and thank Bill Fisher, Vice President of Operations for Parks Canada, to provide Park Canada's perspective. And he and I haven't seen him in more than a decade, but he was a superintendent of Banff National Park back when I was a lowly reporter for the Canmore Leader, starting out my journalism career. So it's good to see you, and thanks for coming down. All right, so I'll turn it over to Sean Fluker, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Parks Canada Act and the legal context in which our national parks exist.
Thanks, Jeff. It is an honor to be here with this, with the rest of the people sitting out here in this panel. Zero is probably the right denominator for me in relation to the folks around with this afternoon. But nonetheless, I think the decision was to put the lawyer first, and so here I am. And I'm going to speak a little bit about briefly to give an overview of how this report and issue came to be, and then touch on how it's been implemented into law. So this issue, frankly, to me, just speaks with the long-standing struggle between the advocates of parks for people and parks for preservation that I think has defined the history of Canada's national parks. And I guess in the eyes of many, what came of the ecological integrity panel was a victory of sorts for the preservationists in that battle, if you want to call it that. As time has proven, perhaps it hasn't been the victory that it was hoped it would be. Ecological integrity as an environmental norm does have a very long history, and many of you will be familiar with Aldo Leopold's famous land ethic, which is currently on the screen. And so the idea of ecological integrity as an environmental norm has a lot of strength and a lot of support. It found its way into national parks policy in the 1970s in Canada's national parks. Shortly thereafter, it did find its way into the National Parks Act. But it wasn't until the amendments that came out of the panel report where I think it was given the overriding priority, if you like, that is currently given in Section 8, Sub 2 of the Act. So the Minister for Canadian Heritage in 1998 appointed this panel of scientists to assess the ecological integrity of the parks. The panel produced a report with 2 volumes entitled Unimpaired for Future Generations, ? Conserving Ecological Integrity of Canada's National Parks. And the panel, based on its observations of parks in ecological peril, made a number of recommendations. The one which was relevant to me as a legal scholar at the time was the recommendation that the Canada National Parks Act be amended to make the maintenance and restoration of ecological integrity the overriding priority in all parks management. The consensus of this panel was that a stronger legal mandate was necessary to provide authority for Parks Canada to say no to excessive human activity in the parks. Parliament responded in 2001 by enacting the section that's currently on the overhead. And I'll just read it for emphasis: maintenance or restoration of ecological integrity, which has a definition in the Act, through the protection of natural resources and natural processes shall be the first priority of the Minister when considering all aspects of the management of parks. And this section was placed into the Act alongside what's known as the Dedications Clause, which is Section 4, which dedicates the parks to the people of Canada for their benefit, education, and enjoyment, and to be made use of so as to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So if you like, that struggle, parks for people, parks for preservation, is embedded into the governing law, or statute anyways, governing the management of the parks. And looking back in 2012, that dedication section 4, which has been in the Parks Act since 1930, has really sort of overwhelmed, I think, any impact that the ecological integrity mandate perhaps might have had, or that was intended that it might have. I've done some research outside of Canadian national parks and ecological integrity. I can't find anywhere internationally a stronger legal rule concerning the implementation of an ecological mandate. So it's telling to me that implementation of this strong rule has struggled lately in Canada. And I will just simply leave you with a few remarks about what is the leading judicial decision concerning this rule. Shortly after the Act was amended, the Minister approved the construction of a winter road crossing Wood Buffalo National Park, which is located in northern Alberta. The Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society took issue with that approval and sought a court order to set aside that road approval on the basis that the approval itself was not in accordance with the Minister's obligation to maintain or restore ecological integrity of the parks. Parks had acknowledged on the record that this particular road wouldn't serve a park purpose. The environmental assessment provided evidence that the construction of the road would impact the ecology of the park. And perhaps most importantly, Parks Canada had not even mentioned the word ecological integrity in providing its written approval of road construction. Ultimately, this challenge was unsuccessful, and it's the way in which it's unsuccessful that's proven so problematic, I think, going forward. The court, in interpreting this rule, has indicated that essentially managing the parks remains a balancing act, if you will, of conflicting interests between those who live in or use the park and the preservation of that park. And so, in the words of the court, Section 8, Sub 2 of the Act does not require that ecological integrity be a determinative factor in a decision such as this, i.e. the road approval. Rather, it simply requires that ecological integrity be the minister's first priority. Now, I don't know that there's a difference between first priority and determinative factor. And if there is, then I'm not sure what meaning you can give to the word first. But nevertheless, it's more the balancing side of that decision that's been problematic. And in a sense, what it has stood for is that Parks Canada, being the decision maker in the parks, is entitled to continue with its traditional approach of balancing human use with ecological protection or environmental preservation in the parks. And when you read the panel report from 2000 that led to this particular rule, that was not the intention of the Act. So, if you like, the result today is that ecological integrity remains really just a factor in overall parks decision making. In fact, it's a factor which can be overridden by human economic interests, which really speaks against the provision itself. And as a result, I don't think this particular recommendation of the panel has really had any sort of meaningful impact in how the national parks are managed today.
So following on that note, my focus today is to talk specifically and to narrow in on looking at that one aspect of being impaired for future generations. In this case, I want to focus on the institution itself and whether or not we've created an institution with recent events that is in itself impaired for future generations. So, respecting Sean's interpretation of the court decisions there, indeed it was not the recommendation that we were looking for. The panel was very clear that ecological integrity was to be the first priority. The minister agreed at the time of making the announcement and concurring with recommendations of the panel, as did the agency. And so, perhaps in spite of legal decisions, we work to the mandate and to the Act that says that we're working for unimpaired for future generations and that ecological integrity is the first priority. So the issue then is, that I want to focus on, is how is the organization prepared for doing that, and what have they been doing in the last 12 years along that line. I'm focusing on a culture of conservation, on organizational culture, and trust me, organizational culture is not something I ever thought I would study, nor ever wanted to. But when the panel looked and traveled across the country, what we realized was that, well, resources were incredibly important. Human capacity was incredibly important. If the organization did not have a strong understanding and sense of unified purpose, we weren't going to make progress towards whatever the end goal was, such that the organizational culture and creating a culture of conservation within the organization was central to carrying out the mission of ecological integrity. When the panel looked across the country, what we saw were things illustrated here on the screen. A lack of understanding within many folks working in the agency of what ecological integrity was. Certainly a lack of acceptance of what it was and its place even within the Act, coming from the 70s and the regulations. This notion of what we'll call, and we'll refer to later, of anticipatory filtering. Essentially that's, I'm not going to pass this piece of information up or this opinion up the chain to my boss, etc., because I'm fearful that it's not what folks want to hear. It might be counter to the political winds of the day. Another aspect there was the role of science in the agency. There were very few scientists in the agency, and their opinions were quite discounted. There was a lack of support for ecological integrity practices in the field. There was no place for ecological integrity in the decision-making tables and in the various positions that held power in those places. A language of business and not conservation was spread throughout the organization. There was a cultural divide, consequently, between those on the natural resource conservation side of the organization and those in the marketing and branding part of the organization. And the result is, from the natural resource con side of things, very much a demoralized workforce. So post-panel, and I guess what I want to do is I want to focus on a couple of those particular topics and take a look at this. In this intervening 12 years, what has changed? Where are the good things? Where is the progress we made? And where is there still, if you like, impairment? So the first one I want to talk on, and I will perhaps shorten this in light of Sean's comments here, is this issue of the role and mandate of EI. Certainly, from our perspective, it was absolutely strengthened, notwithstanding the legal challenges that hold there. However, it's clear that there's been this constant give and take, this back and forth between the issues of built infrastructure, development-based tourism, and conservation within the organization. And these still persist. I would say that in spite of the excellent work that the agency did, and here's some of the examples of the reports that document some of that work they did post-panel, what we see now in the last 5 years or so is what I'll call mandate rationalization or mandate creep. And in that context, it's been expressed that selling ecological integrity has been incredibly difficult. And in fact, there's been a shift to say we need to be a relevant organization in the lives of Canadians, and in order to do that, we need to provide experiences for people. Good, this is fair. But that built tourism, these are my words, or amusement park tourism, is the only way to attract visitors and will provide meaningful experiences. So I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea of opening parks in the sense of making them welcoming to Canadians and visitors from abroad, as well as providing meaningful experiences. But it's been the interpretation of that as being a built tourism infrastructure required to do that that's problematic. So that is, and that's probably illustrated by any number of decisions recently. The Klingon worship, as I've been calling it today, perched on the side of a mountain, for example. But there are many others of recent date that are probably quite reflective of this. So that's point one. Point two is this notion of creating and then dismantling a knowledge-based organization. So I mentioned at the outset that one of the problems that we encountered was this issue that there was no science capacity in the organization and they didn't have a role to play in terms of decision-making. Well, there were, in fact, huge gains made in a relatively short time over the first 5 to 6 years within the organization. For example, within the science and technical capacity, we went from having 2 people with PhDs within the organization to an incredible growth of over 100 PhDs and 80 master's degrees. And that really just illustrates the science capacity of that organization. Without a doubt, the organization has become a world leader in monitoring, restoration, fire management, and a number of other similar kinds of skill levels. However, significant impairment has happened more recently, and of course, most more recently by the spring budget cuts. In this case, asymmetrical cuts. Roughly 30% of the ecological integrity specialists have been removed from the agency. It's been characterized, as it has across government, as finding efficiencies and cutting the fat of the organization. Well, I would imagine that if you are one of those people, and incredibly good people who have been let go, that's an incredibly demoralizing characteristic. And it's also demoralizing, obviously, for the staff that remains. And there's incredibly valuable staff that remains, and they have some fantastic skills. But they're left with trying to keep this ship going with many fewer individuals. And there's also some structural barriers too, starting to observe in terms of the age gap and distribution of who is left versus who was left in the organization. So there's one aspect of dismantling of knowledge. The second aspect is related to the role that that information has in informing decisions. So certainly was and has been increased capacity in those senior positions, and a really active integration of science into an adaptive management framework to inform decisions within the last 10 years. The impairment part of that argument is that with mandate creep and the loss of staff, it obviously has the potential to, if it hasn't materially already, erode the progress that's been made. The planning cycle, for example, just as a matter of efficiencies, has been lengthened for park management planning, which maybe one less plan, woohoo! But what it means is that the opportunity for feedback and for learning from an adaptive management perspective is reduced significantly. There's also significant concern that the brand new monitoring program will be in particular threatened by the recent cuts that have taken place. Perhaps in particular because of an interpretation that, well, the monitoring program is built now, so we don't need those technical people to do that. We just need to implement it in the field. Instead of, again, thinking of this as an adaptive management concept where we implement monitoring, we learn, we test, we revise, we modify, and we grow as we go on. So if you think of it as a linear process, it doesn't work. The other aspect of impairment is the role of muzzling scientists within the organization. Obviously, again, this is not an agency-specific action. This is, a system-wide incidence, but for sure, not only does the effect of muzzling scientists at the higher level, in terms of speaking outside of the organization, have a potential to have a significant impact on informing decisions based on good science, but obviously has a potential muzzling effect within the organization. I want to talk third then, the final one here, is on the role of politics in the organization. There are two aspects of politics. The first one is direct political involvement in making decisions. You can call that interference if you like, but in fact the reality is that from time to time, a decision will come down on Parks Canada to do something that was not necessarily what the agency would have chosen to do themselves. And whether we like it or not, those things will happen. What we called for in those situations was a clear record of decision and a justification for when that happened, so that it was clear where that fit in terms of the direction of the organization, and also a recognition that there may need to be some compensatory mechanisms in place consequently. If you're doing something outside of a mandate for a political reason, you might need to compensate in some way. So, impairment. Well, I can't say for sure, but because I'm not privy to the politics in the sense of knowing who exactly is putting what pressure to see what certain developments have happened, but there's certainly been a recent suite of pro-development decisions across the system. A case example, that's in Show National Park Reserve, so the headwaters of the Hani River, where the boundary recommendation for that was the smallest of all possible options considered, clearly an override decision. But the record of decision is not clear, the compensatory mechanisms are not there. We'll hope that they are elaborated on in the future as we go forward. The second aspect of political involvement is this notion of anticipatory filtering, that we self-censor the information going up the chain in order to not ruffle anybody's feathers, if you like. That was certainly a big issue before. Again, a lot of it because there weren't folks with ecological integrity knowledge or training in more senior positions. Post-panel, with the position structure change, there was an opportunity for that to be lessened for sure. I cannot say convincingly one way or another what the result is, but I would suggest that there is a good cause to be concerned because both the apparent shift in mandate and the political muzzling of science, along with the science capacity, and concerns what one might have when people around you are losing positions, would suggest that it's ripe for people holding back information because of the concern that it will go against the norm of where management is going. And again, I would see decisions like options for things like Via Ferrata, the park, opening up possibility of ski development of Mount Exie and Riding Mountain National Park as perfect examples of the kind of situations where that might happen. So has there been progress in the last decade in spite of all this? Absolutely. When we look beyond organizational culture, there's been incredibly good work on the addition of new national parks and reserves, hiring specialists, monitoring program, restoration work, etc., building meaningful relationships with Aboriginal peoples, and building a constituency with clientele, with visitors, with teachers, for example, through projects such as Action on the Ground. So there has absolutely been progress to date. But if I were to summarize it, I would say it's gone in kind of three phases. The initial response was great. Funding support came, always never as much as you want, but it was there. There were some remaining challenges, but 5 years ago I would have responded and did and said I was cautiously optimistic about how things were going. The last 5 years I would characterize as mandate creep, perhaps supported by the legal decisions, if you like, and it's evidenced by a very recent suite of intensive tourism infrastructure development. And then you add on top of that the devastating budget cuts. The reality is national parks remain in peril from global threats like climate change, from external impacts, and internally from the way the organization structures and governs itself. So is the organization impaired for future generations? I am concerned that it is. Enough that I would say that with the constant flip-flop of mandate, lack of a common vision, lack of political support, and a number of other things, that I think organizational culture is still the single biggest barrier to achieving ecological integrity to the extent that we can with our national parks. Thank you.
So I arrived last night and sat down for dinner with Pam, and we agreed that they were really good points that she was going to make. And a lot of them were the same as I was going to make. So we kind of talked it over and thought that it might be valuable for me to provide some more details on some of the examples that we were seeing hit the ground that CPAWS has been involved with over the past couple of years as a way of kind of elaborating on what Pam has brought forward. I'm going to start, though, with introducing myself a little bit. I'm, as Jeff said, I'm the National Conservation Director at the National Office in Ottawa for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I've been working on national park issues, I realized when I thought about this the other night, for over 25 years. And it's a bit of a scary thought, but a true thought. I started my career working in Fundy National Park, actually working for Parks Canada on the East Coast. After that, I eventually landed at 11 years ago at CPAWS, and have worked largely on national park issues as a main focus of my work over the past 11 years with CPAWS, with a one-year interchange program, I should note, back in Parks Canada on the park establishment side. So national parks have been part of my life and my passion for a very long time. And today I'm basically going to be making some observations on what I have seen over the last number of years related to what's happened since the panel on ecological integrity. And I, too, have a growing concern about the direction that I'm seeing. Often what we are seeing today, the good things that are happening today on the ground, are largely the result of the decisions that were made, of the results that came out of the ecological integrity panel. I'm very worried that the decisions that we're seeing today are going to have an impact a decade from now on what's happening in our national parks. So even though we're not seeing the full impact on the ground of some of the things, the cultural shifts that are happening, I think we're heading in the wrong direction, and that gives me great concern. I would like to also just provide a little bit of background about CPAWS, for those of you who don't know us. Our organization will be 50 years old next year. And in fact, it was a voice of concern from the federal minister in that was part of the trigger for creating what was then known as the National and Provincial Parks Association of Canada. And it was a quote, it was a quote from a minister in the House expressing concern about the pressures that national parks were facing. That was one of the reasons why people got together to create this organization. And it was really about the pressures that they weren't feeling that there was a public constituency of support to defend against. So it's interesting 50 years later that they said that, we haven't solved necessarily this problem and we're still facing the same issues 60 years later. However, along the way, CPAS has been, we were created 2 years after this quote, and along the way we have been involved in, for example, our first project was to get a policy in place for national parks that would prioritize conservation, and that happened in 1964. We were involved in policy discussion and legal legislative projects from 1963 on. I would agree with Pam that it's been over the last 5, 6, maybe even 7 years that we've seen a gradual shift away from considering ecological integrity as the overarching priority, as we believe was envisioned by the Act and was envisioned by the panel, and for which a roadmap was created through the recommendations for the panel, to a perspective that ecological integrity is one priority. And it's an organizational perspective that I hear frequently when I'm meeting with people in Ottawa and elsewhere from Parks Canada. If I make the point that, well, the Act says that ecological integrity is the first priority, the response that I get back frequently enough, it's a pattern that I see, is that, well, it's one priority. And that to me is a fundamental shift and a backward shift that is of great concern. How much of this is politically motivated, it's still unclear to me, but my view is that it's likely a combination of internal and political issues. And it was hard to pin down what was happening at first, because it was more about the language, about the tone of the dialogue that was starting to shift. But by the mid-2000s, we were starting to see things in park management plans, so on paper that would direct how a park was managed, that was starting to give us pause. And finally, I think in the last year, there have been a number of decisions made that have actually hit the ground, that have made it very clear that there is a problem. And so CPAS has ramped up our efforts over the last couple of years. And finally, the cuts in the last budget are an enormous problem that's been layered on top of an already kind of fragile situation. Interestingly, I think from a CPAS perspective, after about 2003, we fought very hard for funding to implement the recommendations of the panel. And after 2003, our attention drifted as well. Things were going well on the ecological integrity side. There were huge opportunities on the new parks side, so we focused a lot of our attention, our limited resources, on supporting the creation of new national parks. So we were focused much more heavily there, I would say, over the last 7 or 8 years than we were on the ecological integrity front. But over the last couple of years, we've realized that we really need to rebuild our work on that front. It's not an easy kind of work to support, but we have to rebuild that work because the public constituency and the public support for ecological integrity is critical if we're going to shift the ship back in line and get going back down the path that we had hoped would be a continuous path from the EI panel. Back in July of this year, we released our 4th annual Parks Day report. And while past years we've flagged progress particularly on new national parks, this year we really took direct aim at the threats that were facing our parks. If you'd like to have a read of our report, it's on our website. And I'm just going to flag a couple of the things that we noted in our report around some of the things that are happening on the ground, and some of them Pam mentioned already, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. And one of the areas that we identified as being a serious concern is the growth in activities that we believe are inconsistent with the National Park mandate and that are now being permitted in our parks. And it's really how the mission creep that Pam talked about is hitting the ground. And there's 3 in particular from the past year or so that I want to mention. The first one is I'll go back to this slide. I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but I do want to flag that, as Pam has said, it has been significant progress made in a number of areas, and so I think it's always important to give credit where credit is due. And on the science and monitoring front, the science capacity, the same things that Pam talked about, as well as the limits to commercial development, which I know weren't on her list, but there has been significant progress, including in some cases on visitor experiences. There have been some great programs set up, like Learn to Camp programs, for example, which help people who don't feel comfortable getting into nature get over the barriers that they face in terms of visiting our national parks and really having a true national park experience. And just to summarize where the shift has kind of happened, in my view, in our view, is that this idea that we move from EI as a first priority to EI as a priority. Really, I think how the panel envisioned ecological integrity rolling out was that it was an overarching bar that the agency would be working towards, and all of the pieces, all of the elements of the work that they were doing would contribute towards meeting that high bar. What we see instead, this is a bit of a simplistic diagram, but what we're seeing instead is an approach that's much more siloed. Really, we're seeing ecological integrity still as one piece of the program, visitor experience as another piece of the program, and education is another piece. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric, perhaps I might call it, about the integrated mandate, but I would observe that now more than ever, the mandate is actually quite siloed, and the work to achieve the mandate is actually quite siloed. And that's, I think, part of the challenge we face in terms of seeing ecological integrity as the first priority. So the three areas I wanted to dig into in a little bit more depth were a decision last year to allow summer use at Mount Royal, the Jasper Glacier Discovery Walk decision, and a more recent decision in Riding Mountain surrounding about a ski hill redevelopment. So last year, in spite of the fact that that Mount Royal provides really important grizzly bear habitat, there was a decision made around ski area guidelines that opened the door to the possibility of summer use at Mount Royal. This was a decision that reversed a previous agreement between the operator and Parks Canada that actually gave the commercial operator more access to winter use in return for having no summer use. And the reason that the original decision was made was because of a concern about the impact of summer use on grizzly bears, because the hill actually provides core grizzly habitat in the summertime. Habitat security is critical for grizzly bears in Banff, as I'm sure most of you know. There's very little habitat left that is secure for grizzly bears, particularly in the Bow Valley and particularly in the vicinity of Banff town site. And loss of any of that habitat can have a significant impact on an already vulnerable and diminishing population. And we heard last week of 2 more bears being killed on the highway or on the railway, and that's a continuing problem that's faced in the park, of bears being lost on the highway and the railway. So this, in our view, was a decision that ran directly counter to ecological integrity as the first priority, because we know that area is important for grizzly bears, and yet we're allowing large-scale summer use potentially to go forward and to lose habitat security in a very important area for grizzly bears. After that, the second decision was at Jasper that was to allow the Glacier Discovery Walk in Jasper to go forward. CPAW's view on this is that kind of infrastructure is more a theme park infrastructure than a national park infrastructure, and that kind of infrastructure building to enable an experience is not appropriate in a national park. The environmental assessment did not have enough information to say with any kind of certainty that this would not have an impact on wildlife, particularly goats. So one has to ask what happened to the cautionary principle in that decision. Particularly, this decision ignores very directly Parks Canada's policy, which actually limits recreational activities to those that require minimal infrastructure. So in the dialogue, there was no discussion. We never heard back when we made that point that there's actually a policy that says that you should only be supporting recreational activities that require minimal infrastructure. This is clearly not minimal infrastructure, and yet it's going forward. And our third point on this one is that really a theme park-like experience is a thrill experience. It's focused on the infrastructure, not on nature. So even if the argument is that you want to bring people into the park, to experience the park, to appreciate the park, there's no evidence that this is the kind of activity, this thrill-based, infrastructure-focused activity is going to achieve that goal. So it really wasn't an evidence-based decision. And again, a decision that we're concerned shifts the focus away from ecological integrity as the first priority. And also with this kind of decision, these infrastructure decisions, it's really a cumulative effects issue too. If we start with this, if we allow this, what's next? It signals that the parks are open for business and that these kinds of developments will be entertained and will create kind of a cascading effects of cascading series of challenges in the future. So there's the policy statement that's pretty clear about built facilities. The third example is in Riding Mountain National Park. And at first I had really felt that the pressures that we feel in the national parks and the mountains are different from elsewhere, that really there's this pressure for commercial development that makes them different from many of the other parks across the country, and that was the root cause of what was going on in the mountain parks. And I was completely taken aback when this decision came out, or the proposal to revise the Riding Mountain National Park management plan to allow proposals to redevelop the downhill ski area, and that should not say Mount Markway, that should say Mount Agassiz, at Mount Agassiz and Riding Mountain National Park. This is a ski hill that's been closed for 12 years. It went bankrupt 12 years ago. There's been a lot of regrowth, and the commitment in the 2007 management plan was to restore the site, get rid of the infrastructure. It was an appropriate EI-focused, EI-first directive. The proposal to open up the management plan and change the management plan was to invite proposals for redevelopment of the site from commercial operators. So 180-degree shift from we're going to close, it's closed, we're going to restore it to get rid of the infrastructure to feel free to send us a proposal to reopen it. We had felt that we had had that discussion a decade ago and decided that new downhill ski areas were no longer appropriate in national parks, and the infrastructure here cannot be used. It will need to be completely replaced. So it's, in our view, the equivalent of developing a new ski area in a national park and shouldn't be allowed. But the decision did go forward, and they are entertaining proposals. I don't know if they've received any yet. So on top of the concern about these kinds of decisions, just to add insult to injury, we saw the drastic funding cuts in March of this year. And I'm not going to go over this in great detail because Pam has already spoken about it, but basically a $30 million cut a year, over 600 jobs lost, 25 to 30% of science capacity gone. There's no way that this can't have a significant impact on the knowledge needed to manage for ecological integrity. Ecological integrity relies on that kind of knowledge in order to inform management, to inform restoration, to inform maintenance of ecological integrity. A year ago, the Globe and Mail published an article about ecological integrity, calling it Canada's latest export. Interestingly, as we face these challenges in Canada around ecological integrity, the rest of the world is picking up the concept and running with it. South Korea, Finland are both adopting ecological integrity as their framework for national park management. Just a couple of weeks ago, a new report was an advisory report to the head of the National Park Service in the United States, advised that ecological integrity should be the framework that they use going forward, which is a significant shift in the management frame for the U.S. national parks. It's called the Leopold II report. So and Australia is also looking at this as the model. So as the rest of the world thinks this is a great idea that Canada has kind of put forward and framed up, unfortunately, we're seeing a shift, and a shift away from kind of taking this mandate on, or taking this mandate where it should go in the future. And the two-page spread in the Globe and Mail a year later had this headline. So an interesting contrast in what's happened. So moving forward, what's needed? In my view, it's really a matter of stronger clarity and focus. I think there's been a drifting, a fuzziness in terms of direction of where we're going and what we're doing that is causing confusion and some missteps along the way. As Pam mentioned, a cultural adjustment within Parks Canada, I think, is needed again, a decade after the first effort. There's also a need to restructure. It really strikes me that the agency is working in a very siloed way, and we can't integrate this under that umbrella if we have that kind of siloed approach. We need a clearer focus on why we're engaging Canadians. We're not engaging Canadians just to engage Canadians. Even the agency says that we need to engage Canadians in our national parks because we want to build a culture of conservation, we want to build a constituency of support that appreciate the value of these places and the value of protecting them in the future. And somehow it feels in many of the decisions that the why is missing. We're driving up numbers, we're putting targets out there to increase visitation, but we're forgetting why we're doing it, and that is absolutely critical to how we do it. And I think that's a missing piece that needs some work. And we need a stronger constituency of support to back Parks Canada up when they're making the efforts to do the right thing. So, and that's where CPAWS comes in, and organizations like CPAWS, and we are really committed to rebuilding our parks program and really having a stronger voice and a stronger focus, and we need support from folks like you to help make that happen. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm sure I'm over time.
Good evening, or afternoon, I guess I'm still on Eastern Standard Time or something. I want to thank the organizers for dusting me off and staying me up here 12 years after the job was done. I'm a natural scientist, I'm an ecologist. I look at these problems through the lens of scientists who have the annoying habit of always asking people how they know what they know, and can they actually demonstrate it with evidence. And I played that role on the panel and with others like Pam and so forth in trying to evaluate how well the organization was suited to use information to guide policy actions, to deal with the uncertainties about how to implement and the risks and the risks versus the rewards. Of different policies, different activities in the parks. When I thought of what I would say today, I thought, well, I'll just deal with three, anticipating that people would go through the history as well as they did. I thought I would just bring up three things that have been on my mind since I've sort of reconfigured my career, and I'm sort of chasing things with species and risk and fisheries these days to a far greater extent. But catching up on what's happened with Parks Canada has been interesting, and there's some issues that go deep back in time that I want to bring forward just as a catalyst or stepping off places for the discussion later. And I want to point out, the first point I want to make is that the real issue is actually not whether parks are for people or ecology. This rhetoric about parks, if you're for ecological integrity, you're against people using parks, and if you're for people using parks, so you must be against ecological integrity. It's a red herring, in my view. But neither should properly about balance, okay? But as we've heard, it's pretty darn clear, and we meant it, and it was embedded in the Act, and I think it's interesting wording that Sean's talking about as well. It's not the first priority, it's just the first priority. That's very interesting. I hadn't actually realized that, but it seems to us as panel members what we meant at the time, what was intended at the time, and what the agency and the minister meant at the time. The other point I want to address is this pressure to reverse or increase visitation use, and it derives from a lack of appreciation of total economic value of parks in their less developed state. You don't know the value of an asset you hold, you don't know what it takes to properly maintain it. So that's concept I'm going to come back to. And finally, more than ever before, protected landscapes are required as controls for these sustainability experiments going on in working landscapes. Through the lens of a scientist, my conclusions about whether we can meet the mandates in forest certification or commercial marine fisheries or anything else are significantly compromised by lack of adequate controls to make inferences. So those are the 3 points I'm going to make. Now I have to go fast because I made them almost all in the first one. So this definition of ecological integrity, I've bolded here, it's a condition that's characteristic of its natural region and likely to persist, including native species. As an ecologist, I sort of focused on that for a few years before I was invited to be on the panel. And it's in this context of integrity, meaning wholeness or intactness, that I think most people sort of get caught up in this notion of balance. And so I want to try to argue that why this notion of balance doesn't necessarily have to work the way we think about it. I think most people, when they think about this trade-off, that's never going to make it over there, is it? This trade-off between ecological integrity and visitation and use, this is the implicit model they have in the back of their mind, whether they know it or not. And it's kind of a diffused attitude that in order to have any of this, we're going to have to give up some of that. There's an implicit kind of linear proportional model in people's heads. Okay? I've spent better 25 years in war with some very nice graduate students studying the y-axis here and trying to understand just what the factors were and could we actually identify that there had actually been species extinctions in these parks? Was there a smoking gun? And this began at a time we started to realize that lots of parks were islands. Here's a couple of views at Point Pelee. I ran around there when I was a kid. That's kind of my own stomping grounds. It's a peninsula by geographers' measures. It's an island by ecologists' measure for all any species that need to live in the Carolinian forest on it, surrounded by intensive market agriculture to the north and so forth. And then we have Riding Mountain over here, this old satellite image of an old Equinox magazine, many years ago. It looks just like the green area in the road map, doesn't it? And that's a result of all the agriculture around it. I'm going to summarize the entire 25 years and 8 lives of grad students in 2 slides, which is kind of frightening to me. It all kind of boils down to 2 slides. Here, we have a historical species area curve for the Allegheny, Illinois, and Mammal region of Canada down here. And we call this doing paleoecology without the benefit of fossils. We've had to try to recreate the historical species area relationship so that we can have a baseline against which to measure the number of mammal species in parks today. It took a long time to do that. I'd be happy to tell you all about it, but this is a good place. And when we did that, we realized that just as theory predicts, the smaller islands lose species at a much faster rate, and there's a much greater difference between historical and current condition than the larger islands. But more to the point, there's the Point Pelee there, there's Riding Mountain up there. More to the point, where these lines cross was our estimate of the minimum size below which the island doesn't function as an island anymore. It's large enough to be like a small mainland. We couldn't identify any species extinctions below a minimum size threshold of around 5,000 square kilometers. In Ontario, we measure things in units of Algonquin Park. That's about 2/3 of that Algonquin Park. We took that work further and we decided that we would try to figure out, well, how much habitat areas inside the parks after you subtract away ice or rock, human infrastructure, right? Buildings, roads, parking lots, camping grounds, and so forth. And how much of that same kind of habitat within the human footprint was around the parks within 50 kilometers. And what we discovered was that there are these sort of size thresholds here, where all these parks up here have never lost any mammal species from historical times as near as we can figure. And all of these parks, the further you come down here to the origin of this graph, all of these have lost increasingly more mammal species. So I'm prepared to say, as certain as any scientist will say anything, that we have a smoking gun here, and those parks have lost species, and they have lost them precisely by the processes that ecological theory tells us they would have, the process of insularization and disconnectedness. And so here are these thresholds below which parks are too disconnected or too small to maintain their integrity in the sense of wholeness and intactness. If they've lost something, they've lost that integrity. So let's return to this business oh shoot, that figures. So let's return to this business then of ecological integrity versus visitation and this notion of balance. If instead we were to imagine that those forms of trade-offs might take, the trade-offs might take other forms, we have, in one case, more latitude. And it's not a case of balance, it's really what it is, it's about limits to accommodation. In this model, we can have, up here we can have a fair amount of development before we lose ecological integrity. In this model, not much would be tolerated visitor use before we lose ecological integrity. But I'm here to tell you, we don't know what the shapes of these curves are. And so while we have a smoking gun that sometime over the past, every one of those parks that lost species, lost them at some point when there was too much human footprint. The question of, well, how much today could we tolerate before we get closer and closer to that threshold? We don't know. We don't know. And that's why I think the human condition seems to be just this way all the time. We're willing to take risks that, well, a little bit more won't matter. A little bit more won't matter, and a little bit more won't matter. So the definition of the I wanted to point out actually implies that visitation can be accommodated to the extent that it doesn't compromise the eye. It's not about people versus parks, it's about appropriate use and limits to appropriate use. Wish people would get over saying the other. But what drives this visitation and use? I'm going to repeat something I said earlier, but here's the question. What problem do antique roadshow guests and protected area managers have in common? Courtesy of my friend Will Stowski. They don't know what their assets are worth, they don't know what they properly maintain them. And so, by all accounts, and sort of the history we heard of here earlier, it would seem that a dominant economic philosophy of parks today is a direct market use valuation, born of a parks must pay their own way kind of ideology. And that's exactly what it is, and that's ideological. I'm not going to speak as if I took my science hat off, I tell you what I thought about that ideology. As a scientist, I'm not going to speak of whether that's good or bad. It's not on my turf, right? But I can, and I think our role is to help people sort of understand the risks and the rewards of taking certain ideological positions as a basis for management with respect to other values. And so, when we think about ecological integrity, and visitation drives revenue, more revenue is going to decrease ecological integrity. What we haven't taken into account is that parks have a total economic value. And that total economic value is broken down into market values, direct use and market values, right? Things you can hang a dollar sign on pretty quick. On the other side are non-market, indirect use and non-use values. And these carry all the way through down here to things like option values, bequest values, existence values. And as we go through this table here, you can see there's some different sorts of these things. But almost always, when we hear about the values of these parks, it's always in terms of their direct use value. Very infrequently do we start to factor in all of these other indirect use values as well as non-use values. And the tangibility of these things, of course, it's argued decreases as you sort of go down here. How do you put a dollar value on those sorts of things? All right? But here's the rub. Ignoring the economic value of non-use and intangible benefits risks overstating the economic value of use benefits. Failure, that's what don't read it here because I can't see it all the way over there. Time for new glasses. Failure to use a total economic framework will bias decisions in favor of development and conservation and lead to inefficient resource allocation. So if you're an agency strapped for resources, it seems to me you really want to be efficient. You really want to use all the tools at your disposal to do that. But anticipating some of the values of folks in the room, I thought, well, I might as well just confront the elephant in the room. What? Nuts? You're going to assign dollar values to intrinsic and intangible things? And I would just have to say that faced with the practicalities of our times, I think we really don't have much of a choice if we're going to start to compare apples to apples and start talking turkey with the people who think in terms of dollars. And in 2005, my friend Gustowski did his PhD thesis on this very topic and managed to get 15 or so questions on the Parks Canada's public opinion survey. And I've never seen Parks Canada ever refer to this work. I don't know what happened to it inside the organization. It seems to have just disappeared. But the bottom line is that 61% of respondents were willing to pay nonprofit National Parks Fund. They're willing to contribute an average, this contingency valuation, that is at $53 per household. And a worst case scenario, most pessimistic scenario, put the extra revenue for Parks Canada at $176 million for a year, or one-time $374 million investment. And the best predicted variables were the bid amount, but importantly, bequest value, a non-use value. How about that? In fact, bequest values and option values fully accounted for 24% of the amount that people were willing to pay. Lots of other use values and other factors also contributed to this willingness to pay estimate. In other words, the Treasury Board back then, and especially now, gets our national parks at a real bargain. In 2005, the agency budget was $250 million. Why does the agency go back to Treasury Board and say you guys are way too cheap? This asset is worth a lot more than you give us to actually maintain. So, my final point, if we look at definitions like ecological integrity, and we look at aspects of things like certification around the working landscapes, we're basically asking for the same thing. I won't belabor this point. These things are starting to converge. I said earlier that, as a scientist, I would feel significantly compromised in my ability to measure whether we're doing the things on the working landscapes. If we're trying to emulate those things on the protected landscapes, what those properties of those systems that allow the persistence of ecological goods and services and all the things that we value. I can't measure it within the control. Some years ago, I said, I used to walk around before we did further work and actually figured out where parks should be best placed in Ontario. I said, just give me one Algonquin park in every eco-region and you'll never hear from them again. People couldn't envision that. They said, oh my God, that's a lot of land. Nuts, you can't have that much land. So one of my students produced this real fast for me one day. And yeah, in Ontario, that's the real Algonquin Park right there. But just for perspective, those are 7,000 square kilometer chunks of land. And just tossed in the middle of these things. Of course, that's not what it looks like for real, but just to give you a size perspective, we're not talking about a lot of land being taken out of production. To be the quality control rooms of our sustainable resource-based economies. So there's my 3 talking points just to review. Thanks for the invitation.
So first of all, I'd really like to thank Jeff Bayless for inviting me and finding my very obscure paper on the interweb. When you publish a paper, you always imagine that actually somebody will read it, and it actually turned up this time, so I could not be happier. Thank you very much. And I've really been enjoying all of the sessions that I've been attending today. I've learned so much. I want to thank everybody. So the subject of my talk is the place of intrinsic value in parks. Parks are clearly, as we can see, sites for contested meetings. They mean different things to different people. They have lots of different interests who want to be involved in parks. So I'm going to do a few things. The first thing I want to do is I want to describe what I mean by the distinction between use value and intrinsic value. It's always good to define your terms. Secondly, I want to argue that these two things are not mutually exclusive. This is very much in line with what the other presenters have been saying. Third, I want to argue that the notion of intrinsic value is not conflated with wilderness. And fourth, I want to argue, or I want to talk about some examples of intrinsic value in a more sort of ordinary way, but also in the way that it occurs in law, policy, and advocacy. And finally, because I'm a political scientist, I like to be practical and I want to end on some how-tos. So how can we actually find a place for intrinsic value in law, policy, and governance? So how do we define intrinsic value? I think we've got a few ideas that it's probably not actually that easy. I want to contrast it with, obviously it contrasts with a human-based approach because it is non-instrumental. The ends do not justify the means. It's rooted in the idea of the moral worth of the non-human. When we say that the non-human has moral worth, we mean that it has value in and of itself. It has existence value. This isn't just a philosophical concept. This has implications for how and why we do things. For one thing, when you talk about intrinsic value, it puts the onus on developers to justify their decisions. So rather than talking about a balance of uses, it reverses the onus so that developers then have to provide the rationale for development. Second, it also means, when we talk about intrinsic value, that we have to consider what is lost. It requires us, actually, to recognize that what is lost cannot be restored to its prior condition. And consequently, it strengthens the arguments against development. Having said that, I want to make the point that intrinsic value and use value are not, in theory, mutually exclusive. We value our eyesight, both for its use value, what we can see, but we also value it for its intrinsic value. We would miss it if we lost it, for reasons that have much more to do with the fact that we can't actually see objects. Another example, public education. We support it and we value it, not only because we personally benefit, but because it's a good thing in and of itself. We would miss it. Our society would miss it. And then when we didn't have it, we would start to see what the intrinsic value was. Another example is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or more broadly speaking, the whole idea of human rights. We support it and we defend its integrity, not because we may need it personally someday, but because it's a good thing in and of itself. We would miss it. It's similar with parks and protected areas. If they weren't there, we would miss them, not only because we would no longer be able to visit them, but because these are good things in and of themselves. And it represents a profound loss, a loss that goes beyond its use value. And in fact, that's the fundamental rationale for establishing parks in the first place. I also want to argue that this notion of intrinsic value is not conflated with the classical notion of wilderness, for three main reasons. The first thing is that the classical notion of wilderness that we're familiar with as a pristine, untouched area, which is sort of autonomous and independent from human interference. This notion excludes people. And in fact, as we've learned, people are a part of wilderness. They are a part of the landscape, just as First Nations were a part of early wilderness, and it was unjust to remove them. It's never really conformed to the reality. So the image that we had of wilderness, which we very often used to try to imagine what wilderness looked like, actually never really existed. So for that reason, I think of intrinsic value as something that goes beyond wilderness. Secondly, from a political science perspective, or from a politics perspective, I should say, I think politics has gotten a bad rap on this panel a little bit. The politics of the organization, and so the voice of cynicism here. A second reason that I think that intrinsic value should not be conflated with wilderness is because if we only confine ourselves to preserving wilderness, then we're just limiting ourselves. It's just not enough to find areas that are left pristine and untouched by humans. We live in an Anthropocene era. We live in an era in which humans are actually a geologic force, as our speaker was mentioning earlier about oceans and climate change. We're living in an era when we can't really consider that the planet is anything but an entirely closed system and entirely, almost virtually, within our control. The third reason I think we should not conflate wilderness with intrinsic value is what do we do if the wilderness changes? Change is inevitable, and as we know, part of that change is going to be human caused, and is human caused. So I'll say a little bit about the place for intrinsic value in law, in policy, and advocacy, and I'm only going to quickly talk about a couple of examples that stand out from the history of parks development and parks governance here in Canada. So first of all, what about intrinsic value in law? Well, I think it's actually been there all along. And I think we can probably date it back to 1911, back to the original formation of Banff in the late 19th century, back to the 1930 National Parks Act. But I would pull out especially the 1988 National Parks Act, which refers to the necessity to protect, quote, intact ecosystems and establish, quote, ecological integrity as the first priority in park management. And I would also add the 2001 effort to expand the role of ecological integrity in that way. What about in policy? Is intrinsic value in policy as well? I would argue yes. Looking back on the history of national parks in Canada, we can pull out the 1974 Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, in which Thomas Berger, although not directly making reference to intrinsic value, I think talks about it when he says, Canadians from the provinces do not have to visit the wilderness or see the herd of caribou to confirm its existence or justify its retention. I can't think of a clearer explanation of what intrinsic value really means. What about the place of intrinsic value in advocacy? Again, I think we see it throughout the history of national parks establishment in Canada. The persistent efforts of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, which has a long and storied history of supporting this notion, specifically around ecological integrity and their willingness to use the courts, which have in the past at times recognized and affirmed society's role in upholding the inherent value of the non-human in their parks activism. It's there. Now to my how-tos. How can we find a more explicit, more clear place for the notion of intrinsic value, both in law, in policy, and in advocacy? Well, I think one of the first steps that we should make is to bring together the language of intrinsic value and the language of a public trust. These things should be brought together more explicitly than they presently are. The legal language that we use to describe parks should be equivalent to the language we use to describe human rights: inalienable, entrenched, universal, and yes, intrinsic. To date, 130 countries around the world recognize the right to environmental health and ecological and environmental integrity. Starting in 1972, the United Nations Declaration on the Human Environment. This has been recently affirmed by an international initiative to draft a declaration on human rights and the environment, which was begun in 1994. We also have the precedent of our private members bill, C-469, to establish a Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights, which includes a public trust duty, which imparts, I should say, a public trust duty on the government, similar to what we have in place for rights protections. Another way, I think, to find a place for intrinsic value, and these are not the only ways, I think there are many, many different ways that we can do this, is in how we plan parks. Stephen Meyer has written a book called, a very small book, it's about that big, called The End of the Wild. And in this book, he talks about establishing what he terms natural area trusts. These are connected landscapes and seascapes across regions and across continents that are not species specific. They don't rely on arguments around species and habitat, but rather rely on the idea that we are now stewards of all nature and how to act accordingly. That may mean, by the way, that we have to be quite interventionist, because the situation has gotten to the point where we simply cannot allow species to and areas to become further degraded. So I want to end, I hope I've given some food for thought and some ideas to think about both law, politics, and governance, and the notion of intrinsic value. And I want to end with a quotation from Stephen Meyer, something that I found really inspirational. And I think that gets to the heart of what it is that we mean by intrinsic value. He says, the enduring value of these efforts is that they remind us who we could be. They make us examine our behavior and obligations as the planet's stewards. What is the essence of our own morality if it fails to encompass most of life on Earth?
as academic here to talk before we give Parks Canada a chance to respond to all these comments. So I am going to end up by talking about history. So we're all going to get a short history lesson because I'm amazed at how the past is present, how today is reflecting what happened at the very beginning. So I'm going to start at the beginning and end with the end. It all started, in this case, I think, with Adam Smith, whose lovely portrait you see here. He was the father, so to speak, of what is called liberalism, which was an economic and political ideology which became extremely important in the 1800s. And in the mid to late 1800s, basically all the governments in the New World were focused on one thing, and that was extracting as much resources, maximizing revenue generation as much as they could. One historian has called this the doctrine of usefulness. If it wasn't useful, that is, if it couldn't make money, it wasn't important. And focus on what could make money, and that was how a nation could be built, was the idea. And Adam Smith and his ideas about keeping the government out of the way of the consumer and of the economic system was the best approach to take. Allow the invisible hand, as he called it, of consumers to make the decisions, and the government should not try to make those decisions. Or what is called a laissez-faire economic system. The creation of national parks in the mid-1800s was a direct reflection of this approach, of this ideology of liberalism. One would think, and often one assumes, many people assume that the parks were created primarily to protect nature and protect the resources and to set up reserves that would go outside of the normal economic system. Well, actually, this wasn't the case at all. The parks were created as a means to make money and to maximize revenue, just as every other decision was basically based on that one issue at the time. Forestry, mining, settlement, and agriculture were the primary forms of land use. That was how you could make money off the land in the mid-1800s. So only when a new type of land use could be created were national parks actually generated and created across the world. And basically, it allowed the selling of scenery to generate revenue through tourism. And that was a new form of land use, and one which the governments quickly adapted because it allowed them now to generate money from empty lands, from worthless lands that were worthless for the traditional forms of land use. Beginning in 1911, James B. Harkin was the first commissioner of what was called the Dominion Parks Branch at that time, now the Parks Canada Agency. His ideal when he was building the National Parks Agency was to maximize use. His focus was to get as many people to visit the parks as possible. And the focus on use was seen to be incredibly important for basically a formula that was created. If you increase the public use of the parks, you would then create increased public support for the parks. If you had increased public support, you would then have increased political support for parks and for the Parks Agency. And this became a formula which was almost embedded within the Parks Canada, first the Dominion Parks Branch, and then the Parks Canada Agency. And this formula worked. It seemed to work very well. More people did come and visit the national parks. More political support was created for the national parks. More money was given to Parks Canada. More parks were created, and the cycle and the system seemed to work rather well for a number of decades. Together with social and economic changes that occurred over those decades, for example, Keynesian policies taking over from these liberal policies, economic and political policies and ideologies. Increasing political support for parks was there to serve more preservation functions. So by the 1960s or so, and following a Keynesian policy which allowed the government to become more involved in the economics of the day, basically the preservation function became very important. And we've talked about how ecological integrity has become the dominant discourse in terms of the preservation versus the use function of parks today. Beginning in the 80s, see, I'm already up to the 1980s. That was very quick, wasn't it? 100 years there went by in a heartbeat. These two people, you might recognize them. They were the two great leaders of what has been called neoliberalism. So Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US were the first sort of major world leaders who adopted neoliberal policies. And there was an increased emphasis on small government, lower taxes, and a return to Adam Smith's invisible hand. The government would get out of meddling in the economic system and allow corporations to make whatever decisions they wish to make, as that would be for the best of the market all around. And so it was very quickly adopted globally, neoliberal policies. And the interesting thing, too, is it certainly started at the right, but eventually the center and the left also adopted neoliberal policies, so that it now goes across the political spectrum from left to right. And there was certainly a decreased emphasis by the neoliberal governments on social services, including the environment and including national park agencies. This graph here provides another of the key things I think that's happening right now, and the reason why we're seeing all these shifts that people have been talking about. The other major shift was a shift in visitation. So for decades you had increasing use, and things seem to be going swimmingly for the agency. However, but by the mid-1980s, late 1980s, this seemed to change. And so park agencies around the world, especially in the States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, not so much in Europe or in Asia, but certainly in those 4 countries, use of national parks started plummeting, sometimes as much as 30% within about a 5 to 10 year period. And this graph came out of Herbert's and Zervik paper, which is a very influential paper that kind of first noted that, hey, we've seen a major shift now in terms of visitation over the last 10 to 15 years. And this really caused a lot of panic, I would have to say, among many park agencies, because it challenged that intrinsic formula that they had always been working on, that if you increase use, you increase political support, you increase public support. Now, if the opposite was happening, you have decreased use, maybe you would have decreased public support for parks, and you would have decreased political support for parks. So this formula then had been reversed, and that caused a great deal of consternation in many park agencies around the world. Since the turn of the 21st century, a strengthening then, because of all these reasons, neoliberal ideologies, the focus on declining visitation, led to almost a perfect storm, so to speak, of refocusing from the preservation function of parks to the use function of parks. And I think we've seen that not only in Canada, but this is happening globally as well. There's been no official changes in legislation and policy at this time. And I think this is an interesting point, that the governments around the world haven't changed legislation or policy, but the decisions that they're making, as we've heard today, have changed significantly in the last 5 years in particular. And Glacier Discovery Walk is an example, the ski field. All these examples are piling up again, not only in Canada, but in many other nations around the world. That's been happening. The Rouge National Urban Park is another example of a major shift in decision-making in Parks Canada to create a park which is in the center center of trauma. That is highly unusual, and it basically relates to the desire to try to bring more visitation into the parks, make it easier for people to come and visit the parks. So too the decision, I think, to create these new tourism attractions. The main focus is to try to bring as many people as they can into the parks, to increase visitation and to increase, hopefully, public support and thus political support for parks as well. Ecological integrity, as we heard, is entrenched in both the legislation and the policy as a primary management directive. But we've seen how this concern over declining visitation, the focus on neoliberal policies and the emphasis on revenue generation have come to expose, I guess, the dual mandate that is embedded within the legislation. And so the preservation use, those two mandates, definitely I think we've seen over the last few years a focus more on the use functions of parks. And I think that's going to continue and is continuing over the last 10 years or so in many nations around the world. So there's a disconnect, though, I think, between the legislation and the policy that exists, that was created in Keynesian times, and now these new decisions that are being made without any changes really to the existing legislation and policy. So I think this is where that some people earlier mentioned a concern about wishy-washy or kind of a messy situation we have now where legislation and policy are saying one thing, but the decisions that are being made often say another. And this is creating a lot of confusion both within and outside of Parks and Rec. Here's one example, this chart. Basically, what I wanted to say with this chart was that even the Parks Canada itself is acknowledging and has acknowledged through State of the Parks reports and similar reports that ecological integrity is declining. They are quite aware of this, and it is quite evident that this is happening all across Canada, most of the national parks across Canada. But yet, there is still that shift because of these other broader social forces, I think, that are often ignored, like political ideology, that are, I think, moving and shaping the Parks Canada agency in ways that we haven't seen over about 120 years or so. Current national park management appears to be shifting to a model which reflects the original 19th century model. So hence the title of my talk, The Past is Present, that we moved now to the past in terms of focusing specifically on use, focusing on increasing visitation, and focusing on maximizing revenue generation above all other concerns. And that focuses on the use value as opposed to the preservation value. And this has been a fairly quick shift. And this, I think, is the interesting thing about the shift. You have this doctrine of economic usefulness that has reappeared and is driving most of the decisions now, I think, in Parks Canada, but also in many other agencies, national park agencies around the world. You have the worthless lands hypothesis as well, in terms of only worthless lands not suitable for any other use can be considered to be suitable for national parks. And you have the emphasis on use versus the preservation function. And an overriding concern of park visitation is a very new consideration for parks, and one that they have been very serious about for about 10 years now. The other issue with the budget cuts is the lack of management capacity. Some people have suggested that it's an organized incapacity, so to speak, that governments cut where they want to decrease capacity. And certainly national parks have seen that, not only this year, but in the last 10 or 15 years, with some ups and downs, mainly because of the panel on ecological integrity that managed to shift things briefly, but I think those broad social forces overtook that brief surge of interest in ecological integrity, that 4 or 5 year sort of surge that occurred. And the other thing, again, I want to note is the increasing influence of political ideology on park. ideology always affects parks, whether it's in the Keynesian times or now in neoliberal times. So we can't avoid and ignore these broader social forces and how they influence agencies like the Parks Canada agency. Thanks very much.
Wow. So you've heard from a number of people, and first I want to say thanks, Jeff, for pulling this group together. It's been great. And I want to thank also the panel members for their comments and their insight and their observations. So let me start with a quote which you haven't heard yet today, although I thought it would have come up, but it didn't. And this goes like this. It says, "The National Parks of Canada are hereby dedicated to the people of Canada for their benefit, education, and enjoyment. Subject to this Act, and the regulations of the parks shall be maintained and made use of so as to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations." The spirit of those words, often referred to as the dedication clause of the Canada National Parks Act, the spirit of those words has remained unchanged since they were first written in 1930. Unaltered, they are enshrined in our legislation, and they've guided Parks Canada for the better part of a century. And why? Well, because they stand the test of time. And we've heard much, and I've heard much over a long, long career about Parks Canada's dual mandate, the challenges of preservation versus use, the need to balance the mandate, and the mandate of ecological integrity, the mandate of EI. So I'd like to provide you with my perspective, and one that's based on my role as a federal public servant and an employee of Parks Canada. I have a duty to carry out the direction outlined in the Canada National Parks Act. Let me begin by first, there is no dual mandate. And Tom reflected a little bit on this. We have a single mandate, and it's outlined in that dedication clause. It's unfortunate, I think, that the dedication clause is interrupted with the phrase, "subject to this Act and the regulations." It disrupts the poetry of the words on each side, and more importantly, it hides the word "and." So let me read it again with that phrase omitted. The National Parks of Canada are hereby dedicated to the people of Canada for their benefit, education, and enjoyment, and the parks shall be maintained and made use of so as to leave them unimpaired for future generations, for the enjoyment of future generations. That's our mandate. The whole complete sentence is my responsibility and duty to fulfill. If I only focus on benefit, education, and enjoyment, I'm not doing my job. If I only focus on leave them unimpaired, I'm not doing my job. The mandate which Parks delivers is a mandate that really has to take advantage of three core elements: protection, education, visitor experience. They build on each other, and I want to talk about how they do build on each other. Ecological integrity, which we've heard a lot about today, is and continues to be our first priority in the management of national parks. But it is not our only priority. But it is the first priority, and I want to make that clear. And Sean talked about the federal court decision, and I'll just repeat it. The federal court confirmed the Canada National Parks Act, this is in 2003, requires that ecological integrity be the minister's first priority. However, it does not require ecological integrity to be the determinative factor in a decision. And so while Parks Canada's first priority in the management of national parks is to maintain ecological integrity, public enjoyment and education have to be considered as well. And we are actively encouraging Canadians to visit, to experience, and to learn about the rich natural and historic heritage that underpins our national parks. We want people to visit these parks, and we want them to be face-to-face with nature. We want them to experience it firsthand. My earliest impressions of wildlife retain a vivid sharpness of form, color, and atmosphere that half a century of professional wildlife experience has failed to obliterate or improve upon. That's a quote from Walter Buell. And that is the power of experiential learning and the experience of being firsthand in the environment. Parks Canada hopes to stem the tide of the growing disconnect between nature and a distracted and increasingly urban population. And that challenge and that issue is not unique to Parks Canada, and it's not unique to Canada. That issue, as we've heard, exists in just about every developed country in the world today. There can be no successful and long-lasting conservation of these areas without the elements of visitors coming to enjoy themselves and learn about them. This view is supported in a 2005 report to Canada's Parliament from the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, which stated that enhancing public education and visitor experience in Canada's national parks was fundamental to maintaining and restoring ecological integrity. And it's this mandate which has guided our work over the years and that has established Parks Canada as a world leader in conservation. Our own research demonstrates the importance of public enjoyment to protection and ecological integrity and the overall connection Canadians have to these places. Analysis of our national surveys reveals significant differences in attitudes and values towards protection and the national park system between visitors and non-visitors. And this really builds, I think, on what we just finished hearing about with the last speaker. Canadians, and here's some examples, Canadians who have visited a national park in Canada were significantly more likely than Canadians who had never visited a national park to, one, strongly support the creation of new national parks, strongly support the use of tax dollars to maintain the current park system, strongly agree that national parks are a source of pride for them as a Canadian, strongly agree that national parks are meant to be enjoyed by future generations as much as people today, support the federal government role in protection, support the protection and presentation of Parks Canada places, appreciate the significance of Parks Canada places, and have a sense of connection to Parks Canada places. The analysis reveals that public enjoyment and protection are inherently linked. So with that in mind, how are we doing on the conservation front? Over the past 6 years, more national park land has been created than any other time in the history of Canada. And I'm not going to go into all the details. Certainly, we've heard from both Pam and Alison some of the expansions of the park system. They've included Mahani. We've created Sable Island National Park, created a marine conservation area at Waihanas, another marine conservation area in Lake Superior. And we've done so in cooperation with provincial and territorial governments, First Nations, such as the Haida, the Decho, and the Northern Superior First Nations. We continue to work to expand Canada's systems of national parks. And initiatives like the National Urban Park in the Rouge Valley is an example of that and an opportunity to provide a window on how we can use a park like the Rouge to showcase the rest of our park system. That model exists in the U.S. National Park Service. It's one that we want to see how it works in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, and we'll see how that moves forward. But success speaks for itself in terms of conservation. Parks Canada has received the World Wildlife Fund's Gift of the Earth Award. Last year, the Royal Canadian Geographic Society presented a gold medal to Parks Canada, to the Decho First Nations, and the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society for the extension of Mahani.
But despite success, there never seems to be a lack of controversy over whether Parks Canada is sufficiently addressing its full mandate, and in particular, its enduring duty to protect ecological health. So is the task of managing national parks an easy one? Well, no, it isn't. And I've had lots of experience doing it. I've been a superintendent in several national parks, and in my current job, I'm responsible for trying to oversee the operations of superintendents from the Yukon all the way to Manitoba. Are we at risk of betraying our application to keep these exceptional examples of Canada unimpaired for future generations? I'd say no, absolutely not. In fact, I would state it's the opposite. Perhaps never before in our history has Parks Canada been better aligned to its core mandate. And we really, truly believe we are on the right track. Just last month, the IUCN, the world's oldest and largest global environmental network, released new guidelines on ecological restoration for protected areas. Those guidelines were led by Parks Canada and modeled on Canada's own national approach to ecological restoration. Parks Canada's approach to restoration and other aspects of natural resource conservation recognizes the importance of integrating actions like restoring natural habitat, while also providing opportunities for visitors to enjoy themselves and learn about those activities. That approach has been adopted by many countries, and in fact, the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity is endorsing the application of the Parks Canada approach globally to help restore biodiversity and increase public awareness around the world. This approach is working in places like Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan, where plains bison were reintroduced. On several islands in Guayhanas National Park Reserve, park staff and partners are working to eliminate rats and invasive species that are decimating ancient murrelet colonies. Over 40% of the world population of those sensitive seabirds nest in Guayhanas. And we're taking action to change that. There's work undergoing right across the country. I can tell you about activities in Lamorisi National Park to restore water levels, the natural water cycles in an ecosystem that was affected by past forestry practices. We're not doing this alone. We do it with partners. We work in partnership with organizations like the Toronto and Calgary Zoos, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the World Wildlife Fund in the U.S., and the government of Saskatchewan to bring black-footed ferrets back to Canada. We're working with the Calgary Zoo on a caribou captive breeding program to support protection of the species at risk in mountain national parks. And we're working with groups and organizations and businesses like Canadian Pacific Railway on an action plan to address rail-related grizzly bear mortality in Banff and Hill National Parks. And it's supported by money from that company, $1 million, that will continue to help us fund research and undertake activities that help us describe, protect, and better understand the sensitive species in the Bow Valley and in the rail corridor. And we know we're not there yet. We're not there yet on many of these restoration activities. We lost 2 young grizzlies this past weekend. So we know how much more work there is to do, but we're committed to doing that. And so while ecological integrity monitoring is and continues to be an important element to our program, once we have identified high priority issues, it's equally important that we invest in restoration actions to improve the eye. And work is progressing in those areas. In fact, Parks Canada has launched, has implemented the largest and most aggressive ecological restoration program in the history of our organization. Now, many people have talked about the reductions that came about as a result of the federal budgets. I can say that the money that we were provided, that was really advocated for by the EI panel over 10 years ago, that money is by and large remains intact and is being used to help fund what we call action on the ground projects. And when we combine that with species at risk funding that's provided to us, we are taking action to restore ecosystems and address ecosystem issues that are identified in park management plans. These initiatives also engage Canadians, and they'll continue to make an important difference to the health of our parks. They'll also raise public awareness of our conservation issues, and as well as seek opportunities to integrate our conservation activities into other types of programming. Whether we're restoring or whether we're working to restore extirpated species like the woodland caribou, or recovering at-risk species like the Banff Spring snail, or stopping invasive weed plants that threaten native vegetation, we are working to restore and maintain ecological integrity. Let me give you a quick example. Farmers, ranchers, youth, and local residents participate in a knapweed rodeo in Waterton Lakes National Park each year to literally pull the invasive plant, the knapweed, from the rich grasslands to help improve biodiversity. These actions are practical means by which the agency can reconnect Canadians to nature and ensure long-term relevance of natural resource conservation in our parks and sites. The Government of Canada has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in recent years to dramatically reduce wildlife mortality on the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff. We've upgraded sewage treatment plants in park communities where we can see a very direct cause and effect relationship between investing money to put the best available technology into a sewage treatment plant and seeing a return of water quality and chemistry downstream that is comparable to what you see upstream of those plants. And as a result of those actions and initiatives, we're making real and important progress in improving ecosystems. And while Parks Canada represents one of the oldest and largest national systems in the world, there's much left to be done. And we'll continue to strive to offer relevant and ecologically responsible visitor activities at Parks Canada places in order to build lifelong connections and support for Canada's natural and historic heritage. And we'll continue to work to connect Canadians and visitors from around the world to the history, the nature, and the culture of Canada. This is key to gaining their ongoing support for these special places. Relevance is significantly stronger when Canadians are presented with opportunities to use and enjoy their parks in ways that engage them and allow them to create their own unique connections with these national treasures. And Parks Canada firmly believes that we will only be successful in safeguarding the national parks for future generations if these special places remain relevant to Canadians and visitors from around the world. And my job along with 5,000 colleagues from across this country, is to ensure that your national parks are managed for your benefit, your education, and your enjoyment, and that your parks shall be maintained and made use of so as to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of your children and your grandchildren. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Your final comments there just made me reflect that, boy, I'm glad I actually don't have your job, because that's a lot for one man to have on his shoulders. I was hoping we'd have lots of time for a robust discussion and question and answer period, and the conference even gave us an extra half an hour to ensure that that happened, and as seems to always happen, we actually went over time. I would encourage those of you who stayed, and thank you for the fact that most of you did stay and appeared, from my view up here on the perch, interested and engaged, which I think speaks to the quality of the presentations. We heard about history and philosophy and lots of graphs from Tom and species area curves and so on. So we had some science. And I learned a lot, and so I'd like you guys, I hope that the same was for you, and I'd like you all to give the whole panel a big round of applause for their presentations. And I think for their commitment to the idea and reality of our national parks. It's a complicated issue. And in a world with increasing human pressures, more people, climate change, it's going to become, I think, increasingly important for diverse groups of people to work together, even when they may not always agree on some of the specifics, to find not just the best, but better solutions, so that we can indeed have national parks that our children's children's children will be able to enjoy and appreciate in the way that I think most of the people in this room do today. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to Calgary to participate in the panel.